As we move into the 1900s, people are trying to solidify what was started with the Committee of 10, but there was no uniformity. Again, education, states' right. So the Carnegie Foundation set down what we still use today as the standard unit for education. That for every hour in a classroom, we consider there to be 50 minutes of actual engaged instructional time. Now, that doesn't correlate to what the experience is. All it means is that there is the focused, specific, on task learning time taking place in those 50 minutes. In 1917, we have the Smith-Hughes Vocational Educational Act. Now remember, the Committee of 10 completely disregarded vocational education. Yet in 1917, we have an act that specifically funds this kind of education. Related to that, at the same time, the NEA comes back and they set down the cardinal principles of secondary education. Here's what they brought in on top of what the Committee of 10 had already set down. That now a fully fleshed out American high school education must include the study of health, command of fundamental processes, being able to think, worthy home membership, vocation, civic education, worthy use of leisure time, and ethical character. Officially, when everything was launched in 1918, what they said was this was necessary to ensure the continuation of democracy in America through cohesion and social solidarity. So, along with those studies, they also brought in dances, the study of drama, and sports. Why now? What was happening in 1917 and then 1918 to bring all of these additional concepts into the American educational experience? Da, 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 da. Soldiers were coming home from World War I. There is a stronger sense of what it means to be an American, to be an American people. And citizens want their story and their contribution shared. We see the growth of individual interest groups that want credit for what they've done in American history. So we see the beginning of textbooks being debated. This content versus that content. And because our population has grown so much, we start to see the beginning of a term cooling out. This is where high school teachers and counselors are identifying students that they really don't think have any chance of going on to college. So they start quietly having conversations. There's really no point in you sticking around. Wouldn't you be happier if you went back to the farm? Wouldn't you be happier to go out and get some kind of internship or apprenticeship or just start working? So in the 1920s, we have the Scopes monkey trial. Now, this was a staged event. Let's make no mistake here. This was purposeful. They wanted to get sued. The state of Tennessee had the Butler Act on its laws, that it was unlawful to teach human evolution in state-funded schools, public schools. This was challenged by a group of educators. They got one high school teacher, John Thomas Scopes, to create and teach a unit on human evolution. Well, they wanted to attract publicity, and they definitely did. This was the first trial to be broadcast on live radio across the nation. William Jennings Bryan represented the state of Tennessee, and Clarence Darrow represented Scopes. Again, this was staged. They knew he was going to lose, and he did. He was fined $100. There was no jail time. But what it did was it started a national discussion on multiple levels. The top level was, should modern science be taught in schools? So you've got people across the country talking about curriculum. As well, it got people talking about, well, wait a minute, church, state, if there's a law against human evolution, isn't that biblical rather than legal? And so, on a second level, a very difficult conversation started to seep into the national consciousness. Then we move into 1926 and we see the first SAT. Initially, this was used to give out scholarships. However, colleges and universities quickly realized that this was a cost-effective and easy way to, and here's the public statement, make predictions about student ability to succeed in college, right? If you can do well on the SAT, then you clearly have the aptitude to succeed in college, in advanced studies. However, it wasn't that clean cut and dried. The exam itself was created by a professor of psychology from Princeton. This professor had been in the Army in World War I, where he created and then gave out assessments to Army recruits. In 1923, he published a book called A Study of American Intelligence, where using the data he had collected from those mental tests, he came to the conclusion that native-born, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant Americans had the highest intelligence out of all the different groups that he tested. In 1923, he published a book, A Study of American Intelligence, where he used the data he had gathered throughout World War I, and he published the conclusion. The Army mental tests had proven beyond any scientific doubt that, like the American Negroes, the Italians, and the Jews were genetically ineducable. It would be a waste of good money even to attempt to give these born morons and imbeciles a good Anglo-Saxon education, let alone admit them into our fine medical, law, and engineering graduate schools. So this is the guy who invented the SAT, wrote the first test. Here's a couple of things to remember. In 1930, he did refute. He came back and completely recanted. He said he was wrong. All of his conclusions were without foundation. Okay, didn't matter. The SAT was already rolling. Because no one was able to actually see the SAT unless they were taking it, it was very difficult for anyone to be able to make sure it actually was fair to everyone. It wasn't until the late 30s when Stanley Kaplan, whose name, yes, it's that Kaplan from today's test prep, this is the original guy, he started a business in his basement teaching test prep strategy. This was the first time someone was able to challenge that what these standardized tests were assessing was innate ability and potential versus known language, cultural information. Because for a very long time, the SAT was used for social engineering, which shouldn't have come as such a surprise considering Brigham's 1923 book. But there were instances with questions such as, Bob says Billy's boat is yaw. Now the student has to say, what does yaw mean? And here are the options. Big, beautiful, fast, seaworthy. Yaw means seaworthy, but that's not a term that was taught in any school. That might have been taught at your local yacht club. So those are the kinds of ways that the questions were engineered to weed out, we can even use the cooling out term, weed out those who did not live in those social circles. But again, in 1926 and for a very long time, people were arguing if it's a standardized test, if everybody's getting the same test, then it has to be fair. In 1928, John Dewey officially becomes the international face of education. He is on the cover of Time magazine, making him known nationally, and he brings this conversation to the forefront about what education is, what it should be, what it could be, with his focus on the individual. This same year, he goes on a global tour and promotes American progressive education as the education for the new era. Okay, but what does that really mean? Well, it was pragmatism, traditional, versus the progressive movement, Dewey. Dewey was talking about the mind being an instrument of realizing purposes, not a vessel, an empty vessel to have content poured into. That ideas and brains were plastic and adaptable, that conceptual tools of thought actually changed one's mind, that information and ideas were only usable and retainable in relation to how they were used, the vital functions they served the learner in real action, and that new learning only happens because of stimulus, of challenges, of difficulties, of real application. So, taking this a step further, with Dewey's progressive way of thinking, this is where, for the first time, we see this national conversation on turning education into an exploration for the individual. I am certainly not going to sit here and read all this content to you. If you are in education, what you're reading here, I hope you can recognize that for a great number of Americans, this was shocking. These ideas of putting the individual into the learning process, as opposed to having the individual be a passive recipient of the expert's knowledge. So here we have Dewey and his fellow progressives truly changing the national discussion about education. But something else happened that changed education greatly around this time. With the Great Depression, suddenly our population is more mobile than ever because they have to be. People are desperately traveling, trying to find work, trying to find a way to support their families. We have the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which funded storytelling and all different kinds of art, drama, music, small-scale schools, getting people out there trying to both lift spirits and get the economy rolling. We also had the 8-year study, which was focused on showing that progressive schools, even though they weren't traditional college preparatory curriculum, that it was possible to still prepare students to go on for college and the rigor of a higher education in a progressive environment. And they were quite successful. Around this time, we also see the creation of the Dick and Jane Basel Readers, Run, Spot, Run, which lasted all the way up into the early 70s. Now we're going to take a bit of a leap. What happened between 1930 and 1954? During World War II, there really wasn't much focus on K-12 education. The focus was on the war effort. Now, post-war and the baby boom, things began to change very quickly. So we're going to jump to 1954 and one of the most important Supreme Court decisions to date. Brown versus the Board of Education. This ruling struck down that Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal from the end of the 1800s. The Supreme Court stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This was huge. The ripple effects across the country. Here's the problem, though. They didn't give any specifics. They made the pronouncement, but they didn't say how and when. A year later, there was another ruling that they came to call Brown 2, where they specifically put the responsibility for getting rid of all this multiple schools for whites and blacks and anybody else and bringing everyone together. School desegregation. The responsibility for that a year later was put on the district courts, and a very famous phrase was used: with all deliberate speed. Now again, this wasn't that specific, and it angered everybody because nobody got what they wanted. It wasn't being done fast enough, or it was being done too quickly. But it became the responsibility of the district courts to ensure this was happening. Now let's think about 1954. We've got the baby boomers, so there's this huge wave of children. It is the golden age of television. Everybody has one big set in their house now. They're all sitting down and watching together. And at this time, there are amazing works of art being presented by some of the greatest American writers of the 20th century. These authors tended to focus on issues of justice and dignity of the common man. It helped society set the stage for being empathetic to those around them, fellow citizens. Many people didn't recognize that these were injustices because they were so ingrained in society that it goes back to the old question, does the fish see the water? Unless someone can consciously turn a light on a practice that is completely embedded culturally into your environment, you very well may not recognize that it's wrong. Put all of this together, and you can get a sense of where the civil rights movement started picking up steam outside of the initial pockets where the minority populations were strong enough to start bonding. Their message, sympathy for their experiences, started to become a part of the national consciousness. Now, slowly, but 1954, the population of young people is growing. They're growing up seeing these stories of social justice, hearing tales, recognizing that maybe the unspoken rules of society, maybe those aren't absolute constructs in which there is the truth. Maybe these are things to be thought about and questioned. And you can imagine this is going to carry over into the 60s and the 70s.